Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy human being you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's true crime video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this that we're forced to deal with on the day-to-day, today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or Bratterstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the attempted murder of Olivia Harrison and George Harrison, the lead guitarist of the Beatles. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week like this week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us, one of us, one of us. Alright, now that I'm done begging you to join my cult, we can go ahead and get into this video. Now this video is on a case that I had never heard of before. Had you? Because I asked my husband and he also had never heard of this case. And that kind of blows my mind because George Harrison was a Beatle, and you would think that alone would make it newsworthy, especially since if his attacker had been successful, he would have been the second Beatle to have been murdered. R.I.P. John Lennon. Which, if you have not seen it, I did actually do a video covering John Lennon's murder, his life and his murder, which is on my channel. You can search Bratterstein John Lennon, or I'll try to remember to put it in the description box. I always forget, so if I forget, be like, hey, you forgot, and then I'll put it. But it's just crazy to me to think that this could happen and it goes so under the radar for so many people because, again, he's a Beatle. But it seems that George and Olivia kind of were quiet about it and didn't talk about it very much, so it didn't get highly publicized. But once I found out about it, once I read about it, I was just like, wow. And I had to read all the things. And now I have read all the things so that you do not have to. And I'm going to tell you the entire story today. Now, at the end of this video, I'm going to ask you a question of the day. I'm going to give it to you now so you can have it kicking around in your brain as we go through all the details of this case. But obviously, I want you to answer once you have some information to go on. But the question of the day is this. Do you believe that the sentencing in this case was justice? Because it is a very controversial ruling, I guess you could say, or one that I believe people will have opinions on. So let me know all your thoughts in the comments below after we go through the details of this case. Now, with all of that said, come gather around and let me tell you the story of the attempted murder of Olivia Harrison and George Harrison, the lead guitarist of the Beatles. And now, just in case there's this weird phenomena, on the off chance that somebody here doesn't know who the Beatles are, I'm gonna have to assume that you have been in a coma for like the last 60 years, because I cannot understand any other excuse, because they literally, I think they still are considered one of the most famous bands of all time. So with that, I'm just going to get into the story. And our story today begins on December 30th, 1999, and this was in Oxfordshire, which is in South England. Let me know if I said that right down below, because I'm sure I did not. It was on this night that George and his wife had had a totally normal evening. They did their thing. They went and locked up the house and went to bed at around 2 a.m. where they went to go to sleep, which, you know, is what people typically do when they go to bed. Now, after about an hour and a half, Olivia woke up to the sound of glass breaking, and in her groggy, sleepy state, she thought that one of the chandeliers in their home, which calling it a home seems silly because this is like a beautiful, giant-ass mansion, but she thought one of the several chandeliers in this giant mansion had fallen and broken, and that's what she thought at first. But then as she sat and kind of like let the sleep escape her, sure, as she woke up, she was like, oh wait, no, that definitely wasn't a chandelier breaking. That was somebody breaking a window, and there's probably someone in my house. So at this, she jumps up, she wakes up her sleeping husband, and George wakes up and is like, you know, like, what is going on? And she's like, somebody broke a window and somebody's in our house. And he is all tired too, so he's like, how do you know that? And she's like, because I heard it. Why do you think? So the two of them get out of bed, and Olivia actually runs to the bedroom door and closes it and like locks it. She's like, not today. And George looks at her and is like, why are you locking that door? And she's like, because I'm scared. Why do you think I'm locking the door? And he's like, not today. This is his not today moment. Apparently, George had all the balls in the world because he ripped open that door and he ran out into his dark home. Now, he didn't need to do that, right? This is a big house. It could take the person who came into the house a long time to find them. They could just lock themselves in the room, call the police, and wait it out. But Olivia's mother was actually there at their house. I don't know if she lived there or if she was just visiting, but she was sleeping in an upstairs bedroom. So he was going out there because he's like, I need to make sure that she's protected. So he runs out into the house just in his pajamas and a pair of boots that he had in his room. And as he descends the stairs, he feels like a cold burst of air, because remember, this is December, late December. And he's like, oh, that's coming from a broken kitchen window. He can see that from his vantage point. And then he starts to take in the scene, and he sees that there's like a giant stone wing laying on the floor. And what this had came from is that the couple had like a big statue on their property. And this was a statue of Saint Michael. I don't know who that is. If you do, please enlighten us in the comments. But somebody had broken the statue and took like this big stone wing and just chucked it through his kitchen window. So George sees this, and he also smells the scent of cigarette smoke in the air. So he knows somebody either has been in his house recently or is still in his house right now. Now, because he doesn't see anybody when he is down there, he decides to go back upstairs, and now he's going to wait with his wife. And I guess she was waiting in the sitting room that was off their bedroom. So their bedroom had a little friend bedroom, I guess. And she's sitting there and she's hanging out. And I guess she had called a member of their staff to come and wait with them, because they had, again, this is a humongous house, and it's a huge piece of property. I guess it was like 34 acres, and the house itself had like a shit ton of bedrooms. So some of their staff, the people who would like work for them, lived on the property. So she called one of them to come and hang out with them, I guess for safety in numbers. I'm not exactly sure why, it wasn't clarified. But she's waiting there with George, and she had also already called the police. Now, while they're sitting there waiting, they start to hear more noises from downstairs. And Olivia describes this as the terrifying sound of somebody walking on glass. So George, again, all the balls in the world, is like, okay, let's see what's up. And he leaves the room and he goes downstairs again. And as he goes down the stairs, he gets like halfway down and he sees a man. It's a tall, young, thin man. And he's running out of his kitchen holding in one hand a pole, like the pole from the statue that Saint Michael was holding, and in the other hand, a 7-inch knife. As soon as this man saw George, he stopped in his tracks. He stared up at him, and he started to scream. And he was said to be very hysterical and just was yelling over and over like, you get down here, you get down here. And George Harrison took a very interesting approach to handling this situation. And he looked down at him, and he just started screaming things in an attempt to disorient him. And what he started screaming over and over was just, Hare Krishna, which is a term, it's a lot. I'm not going to get into the backstory of that, but basically it's referenced in Beatles music. It's also referenced in some of George Harrison's like solo project music. And I don't know exactly why he did this. He said it was to like disorient him. And I have to feel this was just like his attempt at pulling a Hey Arnold and being like, don't hit me, I'm crazy. You know what I mean? Or something along those lines. But this strategy didn't really work. And the man kept yelling at him, was like, you get down here, you come here, you know what I want. And apparently his voice was horrifying. Olivia could hear it from where she was, and she said it sounded horrible, it sounded terrifying. She said it sounded like it was coming from the bowels of hell. And then George is standing here, this guy's yelling at him, and before he can really do much, this guy takes off running up the stairs right after him. And in that moment, and looking in his face, George totally believed that this man was in a completely psychotic state. Now, a taken off guard George was able to get to the top of the stairs, and he even tried to get into a room, but the room that he tried to get into was locked. So this man ended up catching up to him, and he jumped on top of George, who, by the way, was in his mid-50s at this time. He wasn't like a young man. He wasn't like an old man, but he wasn't like a young man either. So this younger man jumps on top of him, knocks him to the ground, and just starts stabbing him, dude. And he stabbed him in several places of the body, but the most notable place he was stabbed was in the chest. And George said of this moment, and I quote, I vividly remember a deliberate thrust of the knife into my chest and immediately felt my chest deflate and felt blood enter my mouth. I believed I had been fatally stabbed. Now, Olivia hears all this and she runs to where the guys are and she sees her husband being attacked. So she didn't think, she just reacted. And she went and grabbed like a fireplace poker and just started wailing on this dude. She said that when she was younger, her dad was like a huge baseball fan and he would always tell her like, you always gotta follow through. So she did, and she just kept thinking to herself like, don't throw like a girl, don't swing like a girl. And she beat this guy's ass. She said this experience was horrible. She could feel herself hitting him. She could see like his head split and see like the blood running out of his like blonde hair and all over his face. And this didn't seem to deter him that much. It did get his attention off George, but now his attention was on her. And he went right after her. He was not like scared of this poker. He just went and he attacked her, and he actually started strangling her. And at this point, George sees what's happening. He's injured. He doesn't know how bad, but he jumps up, he runs at them, he jumps on this guy's back, and now all three of them fall to the ground in a pile and like they start scrambling. But in the chaos, this guy ends up getting the upper hand again, and he ends up jumping back on top of George and attacking George again. And George said of this moment, quote, "I couldn't get the better of him, and he was on top of me at this point. I felt exhausted and felt the strength drain from me." Now, I cannot imagine what this was like to have you and your husband fighting with this man, everybody scrambling, him choking you, and then him getting back on top of your husband. But this is what's happening at like 3 o'clock in the morning, right? And they're doing this, and then all of a sudden, George yells out, "I got the knife." And Olivia was very confused in this moment because she didn't even know there was a knife. She did not realize her husband had been stabbed, and she actually thought that George was just saying this to like spook the guy to make him think they had a weapon. But that wasn't the case. He actually had gotten the knife from the guy, and he was trying to get it away from him, and he tried to throw it. But he was so weak at that moment that his arm just sort of fell, and the knife fell beside them. And he was just like so weak that he couldn't do anything, and he couldn't even throw a knife. So he was just left there completely defenseless while this man was attacking him. So at this point, Olivia again came to his rescue, and she grabbed like a table lamp and just started beating this guy in the head over and over while George yelled like, "Hit him again, hit him again." But this guy again was like, "Okay, let's go." And he grabbed the cord of the table lamp and swung it and smashed it into her face. But while he was distracted attacking Olivia, George again got the upper hand and attacked him. At this point, she didn't have any energy in her anymore. She'd been strangled, she'd been hit in the face with a lamp, and she felt like she didn't have any fight in her left and truly believed this man was about to kill both of them, so she took off downstairs. And when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she was relieved to find that 2 police officers had just shown up, and they ran upstairs to save George's life. So these 2 survived this attack, and they were amazed to have actually survived this. They did not think that this was going to happen. They thought this was the end of their lives. And Olivia said of their chances during this attack, and I quote, "The statistics for those sort of attacks at 4:30 in the morning when your body and your adrenaline and everything is at its lowest, the statistics on your side are not good. Usually you don't survive unless you shoot somebody, but I'm not going to do that." George and Olivia were then taken to the hospital, but on their way out, and I just found this to be kind of entertaining and showed the type of person George was, because everybody said he was a really like funny guy, a very jokey guy. So he's on a stretcher being wheeled out. He's been attacked. He's been stabbed in the chest. And they pass by 2 guys who had just started working for them. Like, I guess this was a very recent job, and they show up and they see this guy that they're working for all stabbed and bloodied and stuff. And he just kind of looks at them and is like, "How you liking the job so far?" Even in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, he was still joking. He was joking with his life and was like, "Man, where was my video camera when this was happening? Because this is the type of thing that we should have recorded." Now, this man who had attacked them was obviously arrested. Apparently he surrendered to police pretty easily, and he was also rushed to the hospital because he was covered in blood from a serious head wound because he got his shit rocked. And apparently when he was arrested, he was like mumbling to police, and he mumbled to police over and over, "I did it, I did it." Once he was treated for his injuries, which were considered to be minor, though if you were to look at photos of him after the attack, he looked like he got fucked up, but his injuries were minor in comparison to like George, who got stabbed in the chest. He was handed over to police where he was promptly taken into custody. Now, who was this guy? He was a man in his early 30s named Michael Abram, who lived in Liverpudlian. I'm sure that's not right. And he was a father of 2, and he had planned this whole attack. Michael's mother, Linda, who spoke out after her son was identified and arrested, explained that her son had a serious history with mental illness and drug addiction, and added that he had a tendency to see things and hear voices in his head. She said that her son's mental health problems were so bad that he would turn over a flower pot and pop in some headphones of a Walkman and just listen to music at full blast to try to drown out the voices in his head. And she also added that her son had a weird fascination with the Beatles. She said her son believed that the Beatles were witches and that he took their music and their lyrics very seriously. She said he was so obsessed that he would go into bars and just scream about the Beatles. He was one of those people that just really had lost their sense of reality. And she did say, though, and I thought it was kind of funny, that she was surprised that he went after George because he had always been more of a Paul McCartney kind of guy. Now, you may wonder, if this guy was so mentally ill, why was he out wandering the streets? Why wasn't he in a hospital to keep people safe and to keep him safe? Well, it turns out he had been in a hospital. He had been committed. And 6 weeks prior to this attack, the staff at the Wooston Hospital, W-H-U-S-T-O-N, Wooston Hospital, had deemed him to be safe to be released. and just let him out. And it's just wild that they released him. They actually released him saying he had no mental illness, which I don't believe is true based on, everything we're going to talk about today. But he was so ill that, okay, so he was in the hospital. He was released. I think it was the day after he got released from the hospital, and I believe it was the day before he attacked George, he went into a bar and just started screaming, like, where does the squire live? Where does the squire live? And at first they thought he was talking about God, but it turns out he was asking where George Harrison lived. So I don't know if they gave him the address or how he figured it out, but he makes his way to George's house. And you may be wondering, again, this is another thing I was wondering, is like, how the fuck did this guy get into George Harrison's house? Because this is a Beatle, right? You would think they would have security up the ass. And apparently he did, sort of. Like, he had really tall fences and they were electric, but they didn't all work and there were a lot of areas that were faulty. So this guy was able to find an area where he could get in, and he was able to avoid security by scaling this giant ass fence, going over, and then there was a lot of like tall shrubbery that blocked him from view as he just walked up the driveway. Now, all of this and the fact that George was attacked and nearly killed was very, like, ironic. And this is because he had actually came out and verbally said at one point, like, who would kill me? And this is because years before, when his friend and his bandmate John Lennon had been murdered, he obviously reasonably very upset. Apparently George in his life put a lot of emphasis and importance on the moment of death and felt like it was important to leave your body a very specific way, and he had even practiced this for himself. So to learn his friend John had been killed in such a brutal way led him to believe that John was not able to leave his body the way he should have and the way it was intended for him to do so. He, though, to get back on point, became very scared after John was killed, right? All of them did, reasonably, because, like, if one of them was murdered, all of them could be murdered. People are crazy. And they figured there were lots of crazy people out there, as there are, that would want to finish what Mark David Chapman had started when he killed John Lennon. It was said that John's murder had really made it so the band's surviving members, George, Ringo, and Paul, had taken sort of elaborate security precautions to keep themselves safe. And George was reported to have spent, like, a lot of money protecting himself and his home from intruders. Back then, when John was first killed, George went out and got permission from the local city council to place razor wire along the perimeter of his home, infrared sensors, security lighting, CCTV footage, and electronic gates. And he also had an alarm system put into place that would, like, if somebody broke into his house, it would immediately report to, like, the nearest police station. But eventually, though, he decided the best thing for him would just to get out of the spotlight in general. He stopped, being such a public figure. He went out, he spent his money, he bought houses in different places and just kind of lived his life. And in doing so, his personal security and, like, taking care of himself and taking measures to keep himself safe kind of got lax because nothing had happened, so he figured nothing would happen. And he said of this, quote, "I don't think anybody could be bothered killing me. What's the point of killing me? There's nothing. I don't feel that important." And then, 19 years after John Lennon was murdered, somebody broke into George Harrison's home and stabbed him in the chest. So now back to their attack. There in the hospital, George and Olivia, were wheeled back to this little area where they were put behind a sheet where they could finally be alone together. And Olivia said she just remembers being, like, so cold and, like, shaking because her body was in shock. Olivia had a head wound that was badly bruised and required stitches, but she was mostly physically okay. And she wasn't admitted to the hospital, but she stayed by George's bedside. George, though, was pretty messed up. He had a few superficial, though painful wounds, but he also had a collapsed lung, which is so wild, but doctors did say that he was expected, like, luckily, to make a full recovery pretty quickly. According to the hospital's medical director, though, George was very lucky, and where he had been stabbed was very close to major arteries, and if they had been hit, this would have been fatal. The surgeon who operated on George explained that he was very close to dying, having sustained stab wounds that barely missed his superior vena cava, and that is a major vein that carries blood throughout, like, your entire body. The doctor said of this, quote, "No stab wound to the chest is minor. In Mr. Harrison's case, it is by chance that it is not particularly serious." He then added that the physical recovery would likely only take a couple of weeks, but the mental recovery was likely to take much longer because he had gone through, like, a very serious trauma. So the two get wheeled in that area together, and they finally have a moment that it's just the two of them where they can stop and look at each other. And as soon as they do, they're kind of like, what the fuck was that? Because this is the only time either of them in their lives had come that close to having to take another human being's life, and this was completely against their will, and it was very jarring for them. George said that, like, he could not believe what was happening to him when it was happening. He was like, of all the things that happened in my life, I'm going to be murdered here in my own home. He said he truly believed he was going to die. So in that moment, he sort of started to let go and prepare himself, his body, and his mind for death. Because as I mentioned, when it came to his friend John Lennon, this was something that was very important to him, that he leave this earth in his own way. He was the type of person that thought about death a lot and kind of thought of it as shedding a suit and starting into a new place. But he wanted to be very conscious and very aware and very much a participant in leaving this suit. But in this moment, he started to think that he wasn't sure he was ready. Apparently, while he was there thinking he was going to die, he started thinking to himself, like, if I was to actually die right now, like, if this is my moment, what will I miss? And all he could come up with at all was his son. He was like, my kid, dude, like, my kid. And in that moment, he was like, I'm a father. I need to survive. And Olivia said, like, her husband, George, willed himself to live. And she said specifically of this quote, George nearly died. And you think, no, he's not going to die like that. He's a very defiant person in that sense. I'm not going to die like that. He was thinking that at the time, actually. After everything I've been through, I'm going to die like this. And he didn't. He survived. But he did have trouble with this. He struggled with it mentally, and a lot of people didn't see it because he was the type of person to mask things with humor, but internally he was struggling with what had happened. He and Olivia even ended up leaving. Like, once he was healed up enough to fly, the two left and they flew to Fiji. They were like, I want to go somewhere where there are literally like no people. They wanted to be completely alone, and they did. And it's so interesting because once they got there, even though they were basically the only people in their area, he would go off on his own. He was like, I'm sorry, Miss Olivia, I'm going to leave. And he would go off into like the jungle and do his thing and try to, connect with nature and center himself, but away from Olivia. He's like, I need to be totally alone. So that's how he's dealing with what's going on. And Olivia was more looking at the situation and taking away what she could as far as what she learned from that moment. And she said that she learned from that moment that she was a fight person. She didn't know. She had never been put in the position to have to discover if she was a fight or a flight person. But she knew in that moment she was a fight person, and she always would be. And it's good that she was, because think about it. If she had been a flight person and she had just left and she had just ran, George likely would have been killed in that home invasion. And Olivia calls that night and their participation, their role in that night, a victory. Now, this is super random, and I didn't know if I was going to include it, but so I said not a lot of people knew what happened to George, and it wasn't hugely publicized, but somebody who did know about it was actually the Queen, the late Queen of England. And apparently she was like a humongous Beatles fan, so when she heard what happened to George, she was like devastated and extended him all of her like hopes and prayers and sympathy. Which is interesting, because the same year that she said this, when she came out and was like, oh my God, George, like, I'm so sorry this happened to George, she actually tried to give him an OBS, which is an Order of the British Empire award, and it's like a big deal apparently, but George actually turned it down because he didn't enjoy like the flattery in that way. But the Queen seemed to know how bad the attack was, which I found to be interesting, because George and Olivia really tried to downplay it and make it seem like it wasn't a big deal. George even joked about it. He would make jokes about what happened, and in one joke he said of his attacker, and I quote, he wasn't a burglar, and he certainly wasn't auditioning for the Traveling Wilburys, which, if you don't know who the Traveling Wilburys is, that was George's band at that time, because the Beatles had already broken up by this point. But there were rumors that it was particularly bad. Like, I don't know how bad, and I don't know how true these, statements are, because, George and Olivia didn't come out and say it personally, but Charlie Watts, who's the drummer of the Rolling Stones, came out and did like an interview or something, and he said that shortly after George's attack happened, he talked to Ringo Starr, who was the drummer of the Beatles, and he said of this conversation with Ringo, quote, I spoke to Ringo about a month after it happened, and he told me exactly what went on, and it was horrific. George was stabbed about 40 times. It happened outside his bedroom on the landing. He would have been dead if he'd been lying in bed. He wouldn't have been able to fight. There was blood everywhere. So that's the statement that he said. I don't know if that's true. I haven't seen it reported like in news reports that he was stabbed 40 times, but that's what somebody who was, close to the situation said. Anyways, let's get into the legal of it all. Michael Abrams pled not guilty to the 2 counts of attempted murder, and of course his mental health was obviously a huge topic of conversation when it came to the trial. Michael's attorney, or solicitor, because we're in England here, said that this whole situation was a great tragedy because his client was mentally ill, was known to be mentally ill, and this whole situation could have been avoided. The prosecution told the court, listen, there is no question that Michael broke into this house and intended to kill George and Olivia. That's not in question. That's very obvious. But the prosecutor did seem to believe that Michael did have some mental health issues, and that probably played a contributing part into this attack, because the prosecutor said, quote, "The central issue for you to resolve is whether at the time of that incident the defendant was sane or insane. The defendant apparently believed he was being possessed by George Harrison, and he had been sent on a mission from God to kill him." He also added that Michael believed that the Beatles were witches who flew around on broomsticks, and that he believed he had been possessed, he himself, Michael, had been possessed by George Harrison, and that he was sent on a mission from God to kill the person pretending to be George Harrison, who he believed was a devil or a sorcerer. And remember, this is the prosecution saying this, not the defense, so it seems like across the board, everybody involved in this case believed this man was mentally unwell. And Michael didn't say anything. During the whole trial, he just sat there. He was wearing a pinstripe suit and he had a new haircut, and he just kept his arms crossed and looked down and didn't say anything. Now, George did not appear at this trial. He decided to stay away, but he did have a statement read on his behalf because he did want to make a statement to the court, even if he wasn't going to physically be there. And his statement said, quote, "There were times during the violent struggle that I truly believed I was dying." Now, Olivia and her son Danny did go to the court. She wanted to be there in person to have the impact, and maybe it was something for her as well, but she wanted to be there in person to make her statement. So her and her son went, and they made sure to bring a bunch of bodyguards. And she gave her statement herself. And in her statement, she said that the whole ordeal was just terrifying for her. She said there was blood everywhere, all over the walls, all over the carpet, and she truly believed that her and her husband, the love of her life, were going to be murdered that night. She said she truly felt in her heart that this man was going to be successful in his intent to kill them, and that there was no one there that could help them. In the end, Michael Abrams was found not guilty for the attempted murder of George and Olivia Harrison on the grounds of temporary insanity. But this was not to say that he was going to just be able to go out into the world and do whatever he wanted with no consequences. He was ordered to be placed in a facility, quote, "without time restriction," end quote. So basically, he was going to be there until it was deemed, or until he was deemed to be safe to be released back into the world. So he was hospitalized, and while he was in the hospital, he was diagnosed as being schizophrenic. So he stayed in the hospital and he received treatment until he was deemed to be mentally stable enough to be released back into the world. And that happened in 2002. Now, you may remember that George's attack was at the end, the second to last day of 1999. So he wasn't in the facility very long at all. Apparently, a mental health review was presided over by a judge and an independent psychiatrist, and it was determined that he was well enough to be released back into the community. He was going to be living in a hostel and have the support from a psychiatrist, a nurse, and a social worker. Michael said upon his release that he was very grateful to his family and his attorneys and everybody who was supportive of him and for him during this time, but he did seem to show remorse for what he did, and he made a statement saying, quote, "If I could turn back the clock, I would give anything not to have done what I did in attacking George Harrison. But looking back on it now, I have come to understand that I was at the time not in control of my actions. I can only hope that the Harrison family might somehow find it in their hearts to accept my apologies." Now, by this time in 2002, the only person left to even have the option to accept his apology was actually just Olivia Harrison, because George Harrison had died. He died in 2001 at the age of 58 from lung cancer. He had been diagnosed with throat cancer back in 1997, but the cancer had been successfully treated, and his family, his son specifically, believes his attack, that George's attack by Michael, is partly to blame for bringing back his cancer and inevitably killing him. Danny said of this quote, "It changed him. We all felt that, and we were sure that's why the cancer came back. He'd been looking so well, but after the attack, he didn't have the strength left to fight." Now, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if this attack made it so that George couldn't fight his cancer and that killed him. All I know is what they had said, and they said that they tried to not let this, consume their lives. Olivia came out and said that it was horrible and it was terrifying, but that it was not a defining moment for them. And reportedly, it didn't physically ail George either, because when he died, when he left this earth just a few short years later, his body bared no scars. And with that, my friends, is the story of the attempted murder of George and Olivia Harrison. I hope you found my telling of it to be informative, and I hope it made sense. And of course, I just want to thank you for remembering George and Olivia with me today. Now, considering everything I told you throughout this video, I now want to revisit the question of the day, and that was this. Do you believe that the sentencing in this case was justice? Like, do you think he should have been found not guilty due to temporary insanity? Or do you think he should have served some jail time? And if you do believe that him being deemed mentally insane and being put into a hospital was the right choice, do you think he served enough time? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below, because I'm very curious what you guys think. But anyways, guys, before you leave, please don't forget to leave me a comment down below with any cases you'd like to see me cover in the future. I have a long list of cases. Whenever you leave a suggestion, I put it on my list with your name next to it, so if I cover it, I can give you a shout out. I love looking into the cases you guys suggest, because they're often cases I haven't heard of or cases that need more coverage, and I know you're filled with good ideas and good taste, otherwise you would not be here. If you haven't already, please don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new video every single week, sometimes 2 a week like this week. And I would love to hang out with you, yes, you, specifically you. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is listed down below for your convenience, along with a link to my membership, where you get early access to non-sponsored videos, priority comment responses, things like that. And now with all of that said, I just want to thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.